Most people assume Caterpillar dominated construction equipment because they innovated faster than anyone else. That assumption is wrong. For decades, a German company operated on principles that made them structurally incapable of falling behind. While Caterpillar borrowed money to grow, Liebherr refused to take on debt. While Caterpillar centralized control, Liebherr decentralized everything. While Caterpillar chased quarterly results, Liebherr remained family-owned and patient. At the same time, across the Atlantic, Caterpillar was building a very different kind of empire, one optimized for scale, leverage, and quarterly performance. That difference would matter more than any single invention. The result wasn't just different business practices, it was a fundamental advantage in how quickly they could move. This is a story of why Liebherr was always years ahead and why that lead had nothing to do with better engineers. On August 19, 1949, Hans Liebherr received a patent for the TK-10, a mobile tower crane that could be assembled in 2 to 3 hours instead of 2 to 3 days. He exhibited it at the Frankfurt Trade Fair that autumn. Not a single order came in. Most entrepreneurs would have reconsidered. Hans Liebherr did not. He began building cranes anyway, confident that customers would eventually understand what they were looking at. Weeks later, an order arrived, then another. Within months, the construction industry called it a magic machine. But the TK-10 wasn't magic. It was the first visible example of a principle that would define Liebherr for the next 70 decades. Identify what the market needs before the market knows it needs it, then build it without asking permission. This wasn't temperament, it was structure. Hans Liebherr was born on April 1, 1915, in the small Bavarian town of Kaufbeuren, Germany. His father, Wilhelm, was a miller. His mother, Matilda, worked to support the household. When Hans was 2 years old, his father was killed fighting in World War I. The year was 1916, and Hans would grow up without any real memories of him. His mother remarried in 1922 to Johann Seiler, a master mason from Kirchdorf an der Iller. The family relocated to Kirchdorf, a small farming village in southern Germany. Hans attended the local elementary school until 1928. As a young boy, he dreamed of becoming a pastry chef. His stepfather had other plans. Johann insisted that Hans learn the building trade. At 13 years old, Hans began an apprenticeship in his stepfather's construction business. Though he had not chosen this path, he threw himself into the work. By 1931, at just 16 years old, he passed his journeyman's examination. These years didn't just shape his skills, they shaped his intolerance for dependence on suppliers, on lenders, or on anyone who could delay action. In 1938, after completing his master builder examination in Ulm, Hans took over management of his parents' construction business. He was 28 years old. War was coming. In 1939, Hans Liebherr was conscripted into the German army. He served with the Pioneer Battalion 101, assigned to the 101st Light Infantry Division. His unit fought on the Eastern Front. The pioneers were military engineers, tasked with building bridges, clearing obstacles, and constructing fortifications. It was dangerous work on the deadliest front of the Second World War. Hans was wounded twice during the conflict. Near the war's end, he was transferred to a military hospital near Dresden to recover from his second wound. When Hans returned home after the war, he was in his early 30s. Germany lay in ruins. Cities had been reduced to rubble. The country desperately needed to rebuild, but there was a severe shortage of construction equipment. Hans married Maria Gerber, and together they started a family. Their first son, Hans Jr., was born in 1945. Willie followed in 1947, Marcus in 1948, their daughter Isolde in 1949, and their youngest son, Hubert, in 1950. The family lived in a small wooden house that Hans had built with his own hands, measuring barely 100 square meters. Half served as their home, the other half housed the business. During these years, Hans observed construction sites across Germany and noticed a critical problem. The cranes available at the time were massive, heavy structures made of iron and cast steel. They took days to assemble and were only practical for major construction projects. Smaller building sites had no mechanical assistance. Workers had to manually carry stones, mortar, cement, and bricks from trucks to the construction areas. Hans began sketching ideas for a mobile tower crane that could be easily transported and quickly assembled. Working in a small wooden shed with local blacksmiths and a few skilled workers, he developed his vision into reality. The TK-10 could be assembled in just 2 to 3 hours. It could extend from 4.5 to 16 meters in height and lift between 650 and 2,000 kilograms. That autumn, Hans exhibited his invention at the Frankfurt Trade Fair. He expected success. Instead, he received crushing disappointment. Years later, he would recall that moment, saying he could have ended his crane production right then. Instead, he remained committed to his vision. He began building cranes confident that customers would come. They did. That same year, 1949, Hans founded Hans Liebherr Maschinenfabrik in Kirchdorf. Business expanded rapidly. Hans modified the TK-10 and developed multiple crane models with varying performance specifications. Because the cranes were built in series production, he could offer them at competitive prices. Within weeks, the small workshop transformed into a factory. But what happened next is what separated Liebherr from every other manufacturer. Hans Liebherr possessed an extraordinary ability to identify market opportunities and act decisively. But more importantly, he possessed the financial discipline to act without dependence on external capital. Throughout the early 1950s, he diversified at a rapid pace. At first glance, these decisions looked random. They weren't. In 1951, he encountered a shortage of gear wheels needed for crane gearboxes. Rather than depend on unreliable suppliers, he began manufacturing his own gear-cutting machines. This decision established a new business line in machine tool production. In 1953, Hans rented a cable excavator for a construction project. He was dissatisfied with its poor power-to-weight ratio. Just 8 months later, he presented the L300, the first hydraulic excavator in Europe. Weighing only 7.5 tons with 25 horsepower, it was 4 times lighter than comparable machines. The design was revolutionary, featuring innovations like an operator's cab, a specialized boom, and a combined shovel and backhoe bucket that appeared for the first time on any construction machine. Series production began in 1954. Construction companies quickly recognized its superiority. Around 110 machines were delivered in the first 3 years. In 1953, a local bank manager approached Hans with a curious proposition. A refrigerator factory had gone bankrupt and was available for purchase. Hans investigated. At the time, only 1 in 10 German households owned a refrigerator. With the economy growing, demand would surely increase. But Hans did not buy the failing company. Instead, he analyzed the production methods and pricing, then built his own facility in Ochsenhausen, southern Germany. The first Liebherr refrigerator was manufactured in 1954, with mass production beginning the following year. This decision exemplified his business philosophy. He preferred to create his own operations rather than inherit someone else's problems. It also demonstrated his willingness to venture into completely unrelated industries when he saw opportunity. By the early 1960s, the small farming village of Kirchdorf could no longer support the company's growth. Hans needed more workers than the local population could provide. 32 German cities competed for the chance to host his expanding operation. The city of Biberach and the Riss won the challenge. Hans moved his headquarters there and began expanding beyond Germany's borders. In 1958, he made a decision that would shape the company's future. He traveled to Ireland. The story of how Liebherr came to Killarney is remarkable. Hans was actually headed elsewhere, but a group of local businessmen in Killarney convinced him to visit their town. Standing at Agahode Heights, looking down at the lakes of Killarney for the first time, Hans was captivated by the natural beauty. He reportedly said he felt at home there. Despite Killarney being over 30 kilometers from the nearest port, an essential requirement for crane shipping,
Hans purchased land and established his first factory outside of Germany. The Killarney plant initially produced tower cranes and later expanded to container cranes and shipyard cranes. It was one of the first industrial enterprises established by a European company in Ireland. The Irish operation presented an unexpected challenge. There was nowhere for customers visiting from continental Europe to stay. Hans's solution was characteristically direct. He built accommodations himself. What began as simple lodgings evolved into something grander. In 1961, the 5-story Hotel Europe opened on the shores of Killarney Lakes. Hans later purchased Ard na Siad, a historic residence near Killorglin, and built the Dunlow Castle Hotel, which opened in 1965. These were not budget establishments, but luxury hotels. The hospitality venture grew to include 6 hotels across Ireland, Austria, and Germany. It became a separate division of the Liebherr Group, an entirely unexpected branch from a construction machinery company. Each expansion followed the same logic. When Liebherr needed something that didn't exist, they built it themselves. By the early 1960s, Hans Liebherr had transformed from a regional builder into an internationally recognized industrialist. His innovations extended across multiple fields. In 1959, he introduced the first hydraulic crane, the AK-40, a hybrid design that merged excavator technology with mobile crane capabilities. In 1960, he founded Liebherr Aerospace Lindenberg, GmbH, entering the aerospace industry. The company would eventually become a significant supplier to Airbus and other aircraft manufacturers. In 1964, the Technical University of Aachen awarded Hans an honorary doctorate in engineering. At the ceremony, Professor Dr. Wares praised him for having the ability to pick from a plethora of ideas the right ones at the decisive moment. True to form, Hans remained humble. Upon receiving the honor, he reportedly said, "As you know, I am just a master bricklayer." The Franklin Institute in Philadelphia honored him in 1974 with the Frank P. Brown Medal for his contributions to engineering and the building industry. But the real advantage Liebherr held over Caterpillar wasn't engineering talent, it was financial structure. Hans Liebherr's business philosophy was distinctive and consistent throughout his career. It rested on 3 pillars: financial conservatism, decentralization, and personal involvement. He famously stated that he never took a risk and never planned beyond the point of poverty. He believed that owing money to others was gambling. His enterprise could have grown faster with bank loans, but he adhered strictly to his principle that money could only be spent after it was earned. All projects were financed from the company's own funds. Profits remained in the business to fund research, development, and expansion. Hans practiced what he preached. He flew economy class and drove a 7-year-old Mercedes. He avoided the trappings of wealth that many industrialists embraced. This wasn't frugality for its own sake, it was strategic discipline. Caterpillar, by contrast, operated under an entirely different model. They borrowed heavily to finance expansion, acquisitions, and product development. This gave them speed in the short term, but it also gave them obligations. When you owe money, you answer to creditors. You optimize for quarterly performance. You cut projects that don't deliver immediate returns. You hesitate before entering unproven markets. Liebherr had none of these constraints. When Hans saw an opportunity, like the first hydraulic excavator in Europe, he could commit resources without asking a bank for permission. When a supplier failed to deliver gear wheels, he could build an entire gear-cutting operation without justifying ROI to shareholders. Speed wasn't about moving fast. It was about moving without friction. Caterpillar had to justify every major decision to external stakeholders. Liebherr answered only to Hans, and later to his children. This structural advantage compounded over decades. Hans's approach to management was equally distinctive. He believed in decentralization. Whenever he built a new factory, he assigned a new management team to it. He did not want factories being managed from above. Each subsidiary's leadership was fully responsible for its operations. Remarkably, fewer than 20 people worked at the group's headquarters. Hans relied on two methods for steering his global enterprise: monthly one-page reports from each subsidiary and unannounced personal visits. He would walk into production halls and speak with workers and foremen before meeting any managers. This system created something Caterpillar could not replicate: local responsiveness at global scale. Each Liebherr subsidiary operated like an independent company. They understood their markets intimately. They could make decisions quickly. They didn't wait for approval from Peoria, Illinois. When a construction site in Brazil needed a specific crane configuration, the local Liebherr team could design and build it without navigating layers of bureaucracy. When mining operations in Australia required custom attachments, Liebherr could respond in weeks, not months. Caterpillar, with its centralized structure, simply could not move that fast. Every regional request had to be filtered through headquarters. Every product variation had to be justified to multiple departments. Every decision required consensus. The result was predictable. Liebherr entered markets Caterpillar ignored. Liebherr developed products Caterpillar deemed too niche. Liebherr served customers Caterpillar considered unprofitable. And over time, those markets grew. Those products became standard. Those customers became loyal. By the time Caterpillar recognized the opportunity, Liebherr had already established dominance. In the early 1970s, Hans relocated from Germany to Switzerland, partly for tax-related planning purposes. The company was restructured with a German holding company for domestic activities and a Swiss holding company for international operations. Hans transferred ownership to his 5 children while retaining control through powers of attorney. In 1983, Liebherr International was established as the central holding company in Buhl, Switzerland, where the corporate headquarters remain today. All 5 of his 5 children joined the family business after completing their education. Hans Jr. studied engineering and economics. Willie became a mechanical engineer. Marcus studied engineering with an agricultural focus. Hubert became a construction engineer. Isolde studied business administration. Each took on management responsibilities in different areas of the company. However, around 1990, Hubert returned his shares to his father, as would Marcus later. The company would ultimately be led by 3 of the 5 children. By the early 1990s, Hans Liebherr had spent over 40 decades building his industrial empire. The company he had started in a small wooden shed now employed 15,000 people across 46 companies in 10 countries. Annual sales exceeded 4 billion Deutsche Marks, equivalent to roughly 2.5 billion US dollars. Despite his advanced age, Hans maintained overall responsibility for the group. His principles continued to guide the company: independence, innovation, quality, and responsibility. On October 7, 1993, Hans Liebherr passed away in Luzern, Switzerland. He was 78 years old. Just days before his death, knowing his time was near, Hans had chartered a small jet in Geneva. He took his daughter Isolde, 3 of his 4 sons, and some of his grandchildren on a final journey together. It was a characteristically personal gesture from a man who valued family above all else. At the moment of his death, Hans's children assumed control of the company. Hans Jr. took responsibility for cranes and concrete mixing. Willie oversaw earth-moving equipment. Isolde managed refrigerator production and the hotels. They continued meeting regularly to make decisions about investment, product development, and finances. Hans had left behind a company free of long-term debt, financially healthy, and positioned for continued growth. The values he established, independence, innovation, quality, and responsibility, remain the group's guiding principles. Today, the Liebherr Group has grown far beyond what even Hans might have imagined. It employs over 50,000 people, operates more than 130 companies, and generates over 14 billion euros in annual revenue. By 2007, it had become the world's largest crane company. The business remains entirely family-owned, now managed by the 3rd generation of the Liebherr family. Caterpillar, by contrast, is publicly traded. It answers to shareholders. It optimizes for stock price. It cuts costs when markets soften. It delays investments when returns are uncertain. These are not weaknesses, they are simply constraints that come with a different structure. But those constraints create predictable patterns. When Liebherr sees an opportunity in a new market, they can commit resources immediately. When Caterpillar sees the same opportunity, they must build a business case, present it to the board, and wait for approval. When Liebherr wants to develop a new product for a niche application, they can greenlight it if the family believes in it. When Caterpillar considers the same product, they must justify it against competing projects and demonstrate ROI. When Liebherr needs to make a long-term investment that won't pay off for a decade, they can do it. When Caterpillar faces the same decision, they must weigh it against quarterly earnings expectations. The result is not that Liebherr is smarter. The result is that Liebherr is structurally faster. They don't need to convince anyone. They don't need to wait for approval. They don't need to justify decisions to people who don't understand the market. This advantage compounds. Over 5 years, it means Liebherr enters 2 or 3 markets Caterpillar hasn't touched. Over 10 years, it means Liebherr develops 4 or 5 products Caterpillar deemed too risky. Over 20 years, it means Liebherr has built an entirely different portfolio. By the time Caterpillar recognizes the pattern, the gap is too wide to close. This is why Liebherr was always years ahead. Not because they had better engineers, not because they innovated faster, not because they worked harder, but because they operated under a system that allowed them to act while Caterpillar was still deliberating. Financial independence meant they could take positions others couldn't afford to hold. Decentralization meant they could respond to local needs others couldn't see. Family ownership meant they could prioritize decades over quarters. The advantage wasn't technical, it was structural. And structure, once established, is nearly impossible to replicate. Caterpillar could hire Liebherr's engineers. They could copy Liebherr's designs. They could study Liebherr's manufacturing processes. But they could not copy Liebherr's capital structure. They could not decentralize without losing control. They could not ignore quarterly earnings without facing shareholder revolt. The gap between Liebherr and Caterpillar wasn't the technical advantage. It was a structural one. Liebherr had fewer constraints. Caterpillar had more. And in industries where speed of response determines market position, fewer constraints is everything. Hans Liebherr didn't just build machines. He built a company structure that made continuous innovation inevitable. He didn't just enter markets, he created a financial system that allowed him to stay in those markets longer than anyone else. He didn't just compete with Caterpillar, he operated under rules that made competition asymmetric. And that asymmetry, more than any single invention, is why Liebherr was always years ahead. Because in business, the advantage doesn't go to those who work hardest, it goes to those who remove the most friction from their decision-making. Liebherr removed debt. Liebherr removed bureaucracy. Liebherr removed short-term pressure. And what remained was a company that could see opportunities, act on them immediately, and hold positions until those opportunities matured into dominance. Once structure hardens, outcomes follow, and by the time competitors notice, it's already too late.